Matthew 22, Jesus begins with the parable of the wedding feast. There are three separate things that I want you to notice in this parable that form the first of the insights that we're going to talk about today. The first is that there were specific guests that were invited to this parable. You remember this story. The king is giving a wedding feast for his son. He sends out his slaves, his messengers, to call all those who were invited to the wedding, but they weren't willing to come. So he sends out more slaves saying, tell those who are invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm and another to his business. Now, you may see the similarities between this and another parable that Jesus tells about a great feast at a different point in his ministry. They're essentially the same parable, but I want you to see something that Jesus points out here. He says that all things are ready, meaning that this is something the king has been preparing for. Obviously, the father is the kingly father in this parable. What did we say about the parable of the landowner yesterday? They weren't rejecting Jesus because they didn't understand or they didn't believe him. They were rejecting Jesus because they didn't want what God was giving them through Jesus. I'm going to show you the same thing in this parable. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. Again, sounds like the son in the parable of the landowner. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed the murderers and set their city on fire, foreshadowing Matthew 24 and Jesus' discussion there about the destruction of Jerusalem. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. This is taking us back to Matthew 7, verses 15 and following, and the worthiness of those who were supposed to be the leaders of the people, but they weren't bearing the fruit, so they were bad trees. They aren't worthy. Jesus has talked about worthiness in other places. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy to be my disciple, back in chapter 10. In chapter 16, the worthy disciple is the one that denies himself, takes up his cross, and follows him. So this is a commentary on the Pharisees. Just about everything in this chapter is a commentary on Jewish leadership. Now, the next thing that we see is that others were going to be invited in. Go, therefore, to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all that they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. So basically what he says is go invite everyone. So it ought to be a big, big problem for anybody teaching a predestination or no free will. Jesus says, go invite everyone. The good and the evil are coming. Obviously, an inclusion of the Gentiles here. He's definitely bypassing the Jewish elite and going straight to the individual people as well. But also what you see in verse 13, it says, then the king said to the servants, as one of the dinner guests did not change, did not put on the garment, probably should see that as repentance. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, in a place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Now, the thing that I want you to see is the idea of the called and the chosen here. What differentiates the called and the chosen? Everyone is called, but who's chosen? The ones who what? Who put on the wedding garment, who were willing to be, as Paul would say over in Galatians chapter 2, to put on Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. We see a similar thought over in Romans chapter 13, where we're told to put on Christ. We see something very similar in Colossians chapter 1. All of these passages are focusing on transformation that happens because we have come to Jesus. Again, the many are called and the few are chosen is not talking about a predestination. It's talking about a willingness to come and conform. Next, they have this question, and it's kind of interesting because the Herodians, those who were loyal to Herod, so they're neither Pharisees nor Sadducees, they are loyal to the Jewish crown, if you will. They're trying to bring them into a discussion. Now, this is happening in the temple, and one of the things that the Pharisees or the Sadducees had done is they had instituted a monetary exchange on the temple, because you weren't supposed to bring in any coin with the face of someone else on it, because that was considered a form of idolatry. So you had to change your money at the temple. They enriched themselves by doing that. So the Herodians come and they want to know, is it lawful to pay poll taxes to Caesar? And then, of course, Jesus gives that great response in verse 21 after saying, show me a coin. One of them actually produces a coin according to their own customs. They shouldn't have had a coin in the temple. But they produce a coin. They show it to him. He says, whose likeness is on it? They say, Caesar's. says, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that are God's. The point of this passage is you aren't rendering to God what belongs to God. Well, what belongs to God? He's not talking about monetary exchange here. He's not telling them to go exchange their money at the temple gate like the custom said. What he is saying is the reason why you're asking this question is you don't want God to be ruler over you. You don't want what God is trying to give you. You don't want to be part of God's kingdom, which is exactly the point of the parable of the landowner or the wicked vine dressers in the previous chapter. He then addresses the Sadducees. So that's point number 2. But the third thing that we shouldn't miss in this chapter is the Sadducees think they have this great question, but they're not going to attack the deity of Jesus. They're not going to say whether or not he's the Son of Man. They just want to bring everything down to a very simple, practical level because they didn't believe in the resurrection. And so they pose this very convoluted question because under the law of Moses, if your brother died and he didn't have any children by his wife, you were supposed to marry her and raise up children in his name by her that would be his inheritance so that his bloodline didn't die off. And so basically they have this idea that if a woman marries 7 brothers and never has any children and they all die before her, whose wife is she in the resurrection? And Jesus answers in verse 29 saying, you are mistaken, not understanding the scripture nor the power of God. So what he is saying is what you're really asking about, you're asking it in such a way that you're trying to deny the power of God. You're not really curious about the resurrection. You want to limit God's power. There's a lot of denominations that try to do this today. They want to limit what God is able to do. They want him to conform to their traditions. But what does it say? For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And that quotation comes from Exodus chapter 3, where God is speaking to Moses from the burning bush. So what he is saying is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not dead. Their bodies are dead, but they still remain. They still live. So that's definitely something you're going to want to journal in your journaling Bibles. Again, check out the links in the description. Also, if you're getting something out of this, if I'm giving you a little extra insight, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the share. You guys are really starting to watch these videos a lot. They're doing a lot of good for a lot of people. So if they are, I hope that you'll help other people come to understand the Bible better through them. The other thing that I want you to see, and this is important for how we think about the resurrection and really causes a problem for the whole idea of rapture and some of the theology that goes along with that. In the resurrection, oftentimes what we see is this gets painted like a continuation of life. It's just like this life, only better. Jesus says it's not like this life, that you're going to be like the angels in heaven, that you're not going to marry. There's no point to be given in marriage. That's a big problem for anybody who wants to talk about the earth continuing and life continuing just the way that it is. It's just without sin and without death. Jesus says it's not like that. He doesn't tell us what it's like, but he says it's not like that. So the Pharisees heard that the Sadducees had been silent. So we've had 3 groups. We had the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees. So the Pharisees are up to bat again. It's kind of like baseball at this point, only they're getting 4 outs, I guess. So the Pharisees come up to bat again. Now, Mark gives us a little bit extra on this. Though one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question testing him. And it seems like in Mark's account that this guy is not with the larger group. He's just kind of been interested in the exchange. And he says, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, and this is interesting because Jesus is actually answering outside of the law. He's pulling from Deuteronomy, which if you remember means second law. But he is pulling from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. You need to write that down in your journal. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, which again comes outside of the 10 commandments, and that comes from Leviticus 19, and it's actually summation of a bunch of different laws concerning how you treat others. And so it's not just a one-off statement. It's a summation of a big part of the law. So Jesus is actually answering outside of the commandments the way that they thought about them. Now, Mark's account tells us that this man said, you answered rightly, And Jesus actually says, this one is not far from the kingdom, which is a huge statement. He told Pharisees, you're not part of the kingdom. Herodians, you're not part of the kingdom because you're not honoring God. You're worried about Caesar and Herod. And I'm telling you, you're not rendering to God what belongs to God. Sadducees, you got no clue because you don't want to give God the power. This one scribe over here, he actually may be kind of close to the kingdom. All is not lost, basically. Just kind of a cool thing. You might want to make a note of that. If you want to know where that shows up, it's Mark chapter 12, verse 34. So just an interesting exchange, but this guy is different, according to Mark's account, from the other Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. So now the Pharisees are sort of, they've had their 4 outs, right? They got an extra. So the Pharisees were all gathered together and they're trying to figure out what to do next. And Jesus poses a question to them. Whose son is the Christ? He's using a Daniel 7 messianic term. Now he's revealing something about himself because they're not going to say the son of God because that presents a problem for them. They're going to say he's the son of David. They're focused on kingly leadership that tells you where their heart is, that it's not about reigning on a divine throne and being an eternal ruler. They're interested in a physical kingdom, and it's revealed in what they said right there. And I would write that down in my journal. He said to them, then how does, and Peter talks about this in Acts 2, then how does David in the Spirit call him the Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. And that quotation comes from the 110th Psalm, verse 1. If David then calls him the Lord, how is he his son? And they can't answer him. They don't even know how to respond to that. So that's your 3 to 5 pieces of insight. This chapter moves very quickly, but there are 4 different challenges that are put to Jesus that he answers all 4 of them. One of them seems to have been an honest challenge when you read Mark 12, and then Jesus puts one to them, and they can't answer, probably because they're fearful of what that answer would mean. So they are absolutely stumped, and this is setting up what we're going to see tomorrow in chapter 23 with the woes pronounced on the Pharisees. Look, I can't wait to talk to you about that, and until I see you then, have a good day, and God bless.